Okay, so just a little warning. This is a heavy topic with lots of information that may sound discouraging. It should not dissuade you from the profession. And if you need to, at the end, just come back and take a look at these cute kittens and puppies. Hi, and welcome to my seminar on institutional violence. So, really, this is a deep dive into aggression and violence in the workplace. So, the learning objectives are going to be number one, like who, where, why, with a spotlight on schools, because that's where most of us will be working. And then we're going to look at assessing violence, specifically at physical cues. And then we're going to look at the stages of intervention. So, you'll have some ideas of how to work through stages to try to diffuse and escalate situations. And then we'll look at some specific strategies for keeping ourselves safe. And lastly, we're going to take a deep dive into our seniors. And it's a specific demographic that has some unique challenges. So let's take a deep dive into the who, where, and why. So, who is being victimized in the workplace? Where are workplace incidents of violence happening, and why? So, in terms of who is at the greatest risk, according to the Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety, healthcare workers are at the top, and they're followed by police officers and correctional officers. The next two would be social service employees, including crisis intervention and counseling services, and then teachers or education providers. So, healthcare workers are 5 times more likely to experience workplace violence as any other workers. And this affects not just nurses, it affects social workers, housekeepers, physicians, admissions, EMTs. So, um, and it doesn't just happen in emergency rooms or psychiatric units. 63% of healthcare workers in a national survey actually experience physical violence at work, and 22% experience it weekly. So, since the pandemic, also things have kind of gotten worse. And you can see why COVID sort of stretched the healthcare system to the extreme, and it really hasn't rebounded. So, most healthcare facilities are overcrowded and understaffed. And then you add to that patients who are in pain and who are frustrated, who are potentially intoxicated, and also due to deinstitutionalization, people with severe mental illness are often left to their own devices. So, while not all mentally ill people are going to commit violence, there is definitely a correlation. Um, so the next would be the drug treatment facilities. There is no drug, legal or illegal, that when abused does not correlate with violence as well. So this includes alcohol. In fact, more than half of the violence in emergency rooms are attributed to alcohol intoxication. So anyone who's working with people who are under the influence are much more likely to be involved in aggressive or violent altercations. Intake is especially dangerous if it is involuntary. It's also a huge precipitating factor. Another sort of interesting demographic that is worth mentioning, it's not up here, but it's actually pharmacists. They have seen a huge uptick in violence and aggression in the workplace. And while their scope has expanded, so has the increase in workplace incidents of violence. The next would be residential facilities and halfway houses, juvenile residents. These are kind of another hotbed for violence and aggression. These places often have high turnover rates and poorly trained staff, and there are workers with a subsection that has issues of family trauma, mental illness, substance abuse, and coupled that with the loss of freedom and autonomy, this can be a boiling point or a hotbed for violence. The next would be universities and campus facilities. The textbook spent a great deal of time on this, and it was really kind of interesting. Universities now almost all have counseling services, and for many, like this is their first time away from home, their independence, first time freedoms experimenting, and it's also when many mental illnesses sort of rear their heads. And due to the fear of negative publicity, large for a large part, the underreporting of issues is a huge problem, as is many issues being swept under the rug. And that leaves students and staff kind of woefully unaware of the potential dangers and kind of walk around campus with a false sense of security. The next would be schools, which we'll talk more about in just a few minutes. And then finally is nursing homes. And so the elderly have become one of the most, in some ways, more dangerous demographics to work with, just in terms of possible violence and aggression. We're going to discuss more about that further along in the presentation. Now, a commonality in all of this is that the public health sector and social services, that there's just a lot of frustration from all sides. Those working in the field are often made to feel like it happened because they didn't do their job right. And besides, it is part of the job, isn't it? So, considering our jobs, I wanted to spend a little time putting a spotlight on education and focus on violence and aggression in our profession. So, children have challenges and complexities, and the system is just starved. That's from Sherry Brown, Canadian Teachers Federation. And schools are a microcosm of our society. And as the society becomes more complex, so do our classrooms and schools. That's from Ryan Liz, the president of the Nova Scotia Teachers Union. And he was, well, actually, I'm just going to show you some of these. So, I made sure that I chose articles and headlines from Canada, just in the last, that were quite recent in the last couple of years. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. Like when you go down the rabbit hole, there's a lot of things going on in our school systems. So that quote, they were interesting because it talks about the complexities, and he was responding to a recent survey that found that 92% of teachers in Nova Scotia had witnessed violence at school, and 55% had actually been victims of violence or threats of violent acts. And in fact, there was a Nova Scotia Freedom of Information request, and that exposed a national problem. It revealed, specifically in Nova Scotia, in 2020 and 2021, schools were closed. They were for several weeks due to COVID, but there were still 11,240 violent incidents that were reported during the school year. And then it was claimed by the premier that this was on par with other school years, and kind of like nothing to see here response. But it was actually shown that violent incidents were actually twice as common in the aftermath of that spring COVID shutdown. And also, interestingly, the previous incidents reported were primarily from elementary schools, whereas the surge of incidents was now in grade 5s to 9. And this trend is across Canada. Biting, kicking, hitting, and verbal abuse are so prevalent in Manitoba, for example, that the province, their health and safety department, now classifies school as a high-risk industry. And in Nova Scotia's education services, now number 2 behind healthcare and social services in terms of risk and compensation claims, and due to violence claims, it is highest above all other industries. And looking specifically at Nova Scotia, because Interestingly, that is, there's a couple of provinces that are doing a really good job of putting or looking at this. Nova Scotia, Ontario, uh, for example. Uh, but like the Globe and Mail requested data on violent incidents from schools across the country, 21 different boards actually, and there were only two that they did not get the information that they requested. They got it, but it was like just a couple of years as opposed to the decades of research that, or a full decade of research that other provinces offered. And it was not. It was not separated into categories of violence. So, um, what's interesting is that only 1 in 5 is kind of that's what they're in terms of potentially reporting. So, what that means is that the study suggests that only 1 in 5 teachers who were victims of physical or verbal violence at their schools actually report the incidents or make particular documentations of it. So the question is why? Why does that happen? And the first reason is that many people are embarrassed. They kind of feel like they should be better at their job, or they're embarrassed that it happened, or that they were the target. And so that is a mitigating factor in why people don't report. Uh, Another is, of course, pushback. That could be pushback from the parents, but it can also be pushback from administration. It can be, in terms of like EAs, it can be pushback from other people in the profession. And so they're not forthcoming about it. Also, especially if it's habitual or if it's like repeat offenders, for lack of a better term, they have a tendency to, just dismiss certain instances because they might not be as serious as other ones. And so, because it's not serious enough, there's not a point in reporting it. Uh, and then also there is a lot of victim blaming that it must have been, brought on, or that it was caused by mishandling, or, in some way they deserved or had provoked or made the situation worse. And then the biggest one is because it's just part of the job. So which brings me to my discussion question, which is, to what extent is physical and verbal violence a part of your job? And or like, has violence towards teachers, administration, EAs, and other adults become normalized in education? And what ways do you think your experience with violence in schools will change as we move from the classroom to the ESS role? Now, another thing I just wanted to show you quickly was, you've probably seen this, but this is a newer version, the Teacher's Rights to Work in a Healthy and Safe Environment. It was published in February 5th. And of course, Policy 703 states that school personnel and students in the public school system have the right to work and to learn in a safe, orderly, productive, respectful, and harassment-free environment. But it also, kind of in a smaller print, notes that Policy 322 on inclusion education does not trump this policy. So we have the exceptions to behaviors not to be tolerated in schools. I won't read that, but underneath it, that said, any behavior that endangers the health and safety of teaching staff should not be tolerated. So I found it interesting with Kelly Lamrock's statements, the Ombudsman for New Brunswick, discussing just in the news, I think it was yesterday, about alternate settings, and just thought it was an interesting read. And if you are interested, it is worthwhile. So hopefully the spotlight didn't shine too harshly, because there are things we, especially in our future roles, can do about it. And one thing, as Sandy has mentioned, we'll be playing a supportive role in our schools. We'll be supporting teachers as well as students, and we will be privy to information. And according to our textbooks, 85 to 90% of violence is preventable. So, to share one of my biggest takeaways from the topic is that the greatest predictor of violence is prior acts of violence. So there's some other signs, other predictors. So males between 15 and 30, or seniors with dementia or Alzheimer's, trauma or histories of family trauma or violence in the home, social stressors like divorce, a move, death, breakups. And you can imagine what some of those would be in our kids and students. And also add to that the environmental factors like overcrowding, bad lighting, loud noises, and then also like stressful demands from, like, say, teachers to do tasks they don't believe that they'll be successful at. Um, so, with all of those things, you're kind of building like a perfect storm. And with enough information, though, we can often predict or spot violence before it actually happens. And there are some specific warning signs or physical cues that they can look for. And they include clenched fists and tense muscles, closed body position, also like a defensive and it's a defensive stance or defensive displays, twitching muscles. They also bulging eyes or darting eyes. They can also avoid eye contact. That's another one. Pacing, and then approaching, then retreating, sort of like coming in and out of your space. That could be the individual trying to gather enough courage for an assault. They also have an expanded sense of personal space, which can be up to 8 feet. And if you encroach in on this perceived personal space, that can be very threatening. So 8 feet is quite a large distance. Think of the changes in speech in terms like yelling, swearing, but also like garbled speech or ranting, those types of things. Threats, that's a big one. So there's a big correlation between threats of violence and acting on those threats. So the more specific the threat is, like the person to the person, the method, the time, the more serious that threat should be taken. Um, and then, of course, throwing, hitting, punching, those are definitely signs. Now, the more the indicators are combined, the higher the potential for violence becomes. And you can also just ask, like, have you, done this before? And if they answer yes, then you can assess the situation. That's very high. You can proceed also like to how, when, and where, and then you can perform your assessments. So, um, if you are perceiving violence, you can assume a host of things about the client, and you can read in our chapter. There's a lot of to do or you can assume lists and also don't do lists. They're all found in the chapter, but all of this, by the way, is precipitated by any signs or heightened with any signs of impairment. But if violence is predicted, then we need to intervene. So we have assessed and feel like violence is very likely possible. We now begin going through the steps of intervening. And there are 9 steps that you can go through, and they should be done sequentially with the hopes that each step will result in a de-escalation of the situation. So level 1, the goal is to prevent further escalation. Level 2 aims to reduce the target symptoms. And level 3 is about maintaining the safety of the client and the staff. So step 1 is education. And in this step, that's the early phase of escalation. You're verbally connecting and staying connected. And you really want to let them know what is happening to them, the why and how. So this first contact is really important, and their feelings count. You're developing a rapport and credibility, and you have to make a decision about how directive or non-directive. It's going to be a quick judgment call. Open-ended questions are crucial, and it's really important to stay kind of calm yourself, but just calm down is not a good start. It rarely works. That just usually indicates to the person who's escalating that they are not in control, but someone else is. And you want to make sure you're avoiding arguing with them. So, no false promises. Glasser's theory, reality theory, with its emphasis on self control and choice and agency, is kind of where you want to head towards. So, just pointing out that there are where things are headed, it's also helpful. And throughout, clients need to be given those choices. Yeah, like again, Glasser's choice theory is and something you might want to look into. And there's also something called life space interventions. And if you're interested, you can kind of go down that rabbit hole. Um, so empathizing with their perspective, it's not lying, just demonstrating understanding, that why you understand why someone is feeling the way they are. It's not condoning it, but it is developing that rapport. So step 2 is avoidance of conflict. So this is confronting the inappropriate behavior, but non-confrontationally. So this is like no displays of anger or fear, just being clear. The idea is when you are talking, you go slower and lower than the person. Uh, we all know teachers who sometimes maybe push other students into escalations. So that's sometimes matching or threat with threat. So we want to avoid that. You want to indicate the choices and consequences are. You want to be truthful because loss of credibility can be catastrophic. You may need to make a judgment call and have a neutral party kind of called in. Uh, but again, that's going to be your perception because sometimes that can be seen as like a reinforcing the behavior. Choices can be things like let's go get a drink, let's go for a walk, and just remember like shouting and yelling are preferable to the alternative. So the next step is appeasement, and it's best used when the violence or aggression is easily avoidable, and or you're alone and you can't get assistance. Some people kind of have a hard time with this as they see it as a win-lose exchange, but remember we're being really empathetic, and we can we know that the client is feeling overwhelmed or scared or frustrated or at loss or feel no control. So if the demand is simple and reasonable, even though they're making it poorly, this can be, just a way to avoid it. And then the next one would be deflection. So this is an attempt to shift to a less threatening topic. So a way to not threaten the client or match the confrontation of the client, but rather humanize the client, parceling out the problem into digestible pieces. So that's kind of it just makes the situation solvable and helps the client save face. So first this, then that. So in the textbook, they call it the grandma's law. So first you eat your spinach, then you get your ice cream. So you can use food as a motivation or drink. You can also be really helpful. Ultimate deflection happens. It forces the brain to do something. If you give them food or a drink, it forces the brain to do something else. So you can also deflect to like a physical activity. And we're looking in the moment just to de-escalate. So step 5 is called timeout. It's asking them to leave the immediate high stress environment and go to a reduced stimulus environment. It's just another opportunity to give them a way out. Nothing's happened yet. It allows an opportunity for them to problem solve, make a choice, reflect, and calm down. It should be stated in a calm, like no nonsense, no negotiating manner. And if this does not result in compliance, then it's time to contain the situation. And step 6 is a show of force. So if the client is non-compliant, and remember, it is a continuum, so then it's time to get others. At this point, the potential for violence is very high. So it demonstrates compliance is requested, and an attempt to deal with it alone is no longer an option. So if you're alone, remember safety is paramount. The next stage is seclusion. So This is kind of like an involuntary timeout, and it's only used when imminent danger to themselves or others. So this is a low sensory area, not sensory deprived. There should be reassurances that this is just temporary, but your communication is calm, direct, brief, but kind. So the next stage would be restraints. It's this is there's no other real options here. So very closely regulated, and it is controversial, but one person for each limb and a leader, like 5 people. It should be someone other than the crisis worker because it can create barriers to the relationship and create ruptures that are very difficult to restore. So these are your last resort measures. And then finally, of course, sedation would be a medical decision, which is totally out of the crisis worker's hands. So remembering that it is that continuum, the first 6 steps haven't worked, and 7, 8, 9 may not be an option. So the next thing would
Let's
be
talk
how
about
to keep
keeping
ourselves
ourselves
safe.
safe.
So there's an excellent podcast episode. It's from a podcast called Psych Everywhere. And the episode was called Preparing Counselors for Potential Violence in the Work. And it was an interview with Dr. Kostopoulos. And this was one of the only 4 sources I could find that specifically focuses on keeping the counselor safe. And she, or Dr. Kostopoulos, condenses the previous intervention steps that I just talked about into an analogy of a balloon. So as the anger builds, it's like a balloon, and the tension around them becomes thinner, and you have to convince them to let the air out so it doesn't explode. So you can sneak the air out by joining them, which is that showing empathy, education factor, restating things, really creating a connection so that you can let the air out together. Or you can try to sneak it out by using distractions and humor. And those are steps 3 and 4 of the interventions. But lastly, you can flee and you can get help and get out before they blow. So our first line of defense is our physical space. So you need to be aware of potential weapons like scissors, staples, heavy decor items. They should be avoided or stored away. Your furniture should be heavy and difficult to move, and the seating should be thought out. So both client and counselor should have clear access to the door, but you should be able to leave the room without having to confront the client or cross the client's personal space. The other part would be you need to avoid staying isolated, and you need to let people know where you are and when you should be back. And even if you are in that de-escalation, you should be moving your body towards the door or a call button. So even if you aren't going to end up needing to call for help, the process needs to begin as soon as you feel threatened. Even just staying calm but louder with your voice to make sure that someone else can hear you if needed. And so while you would never want to be in a violent or volatile situation, you should consider it a possibility. And it's not just one and done. Like as a newbie, we are at a much greater risk, in a large part because we don't consider or believe the risk is that high. And statistically, incidents of assault decrease the more years of experience the counselor has. So just take a second to consider the what if before a session, even momentarily, just to make sure you do have a plan if it is needed. There is also often sort of disbelief or doubt that occurs during a crisis. You may be inclined to want to minimize the threat that you feel. And it's really important to trust your instincts because in most cases, it is better to err on the side of caution. Moving into that crisis awareness mode will not escalate the situation because your first step is to remain calm and begin the steps of intervention. But if a violent or aggressive incident has happened, it is important to debrief about the situation. And it's not about blaming or unloading, it's just unloading about the stressful situation and getting some support for yourself. And it's important when you're ready to do what we call a psychological autopsy. That's clearly going through the incident with everyone involved, and you're looking at the behaviors, actions, and reactions of all the who are involved. including the client, but so that you can move forward with the best intentions and information to
So I'm
best serve your
cognizant of
client.
time, but I did want to talk briefly about a topic that's near and dear to my heart. Uh, one that I'm intimately aware of. My father battled with Alzheimer's from diagnosis to his eventual death. It was 11 years actually. And I did have to cope with a couple of instances where violence and aggression became an issue. So I was really lucky though, and most of us will have to deal with our own parents and aging. And I wanted to talk to you specifically about them in times of crisis. So, when dealing with agitated seniors, you want to assess quickly for a few things like one, how or to what degree of disorientation and agitation are they in? And two, you just want to calm them down and get them back to their baseline or a relative state of equilibrium. So, agitation and aggression in older adults can stem from a variety of factors. That's including physical discomfort, cognitive decline, medication side effects, environmental stressors, and often there's like a comorbidity, like depression often comes along with Alzheimer's and dementia. And seniors often reserve like their worst behavior for those that are closest to them, like family members and caregivers. But other times, that lack of a relationship, it can be the cause of distress. So, being calm, not frustrated, making them feel cared for, that relationship is key. Getting older is scary enough, and sometimes just getting down at their eye level and holding a hand and becoming reassuring can help to destabilize. So, reality orientation focuses on anchoring clients to who they are, where they are, and why they are there. So, this is done by orientating the person to the present during most interactions, like telling them where they are, the date, the time, etc. And this is helpful until it isn't. That is, if you go back to that assessment step, if they are advanced in the progression of their illness, this can become further disorienting and upsetting. So, in many cases, recent memories deteriorate first for people with Alzheimer's and dementia. And so, sharing memories from the past through reminiscent therapy, people can develop more positive feelings and it reduces their stress and agitation. So, it just allowing seniors to talk about the past, sharing memories, and that kind of bridges that connection too. And it also kind of validates the person acknowledging their past accomplishments and who they really are. Anchoring is simply connecting that senior with the here and now. It's pretty calm but direct, stating who you are, what is going on right now, and what is going to happen next. Uh, there was a funny little incident where we brought a birthday cake to my dad in his assisted care facility, and we had to basically anchor each person as we passed around the cake, as they each asked, like, whose birthday was it? Why are we getting cake? And I think by the end of that interaction, every single person in the room thought that it was their birthday, but they were very happy that they got to eat cake. So, finding opportunities to decipher or validate distorted thinking, this can be very helpful. So, the idea is that when you, well, the idea of losing their grip on reality is terrifying. So, if you can sort out or explain to them how their perception may just be a deception of their mind by helping them understand the distortion and by helping them see that it's an illusion and what it is that can help calm them and to restore them to a non-agitated state. It's just a matter of sort of detangling their interpretation and understanding that it's not a complete hallucination. It was just misperception. Redirection, it can be a very useful technique. It's often can be done with what are called security blankets. For my dad, it was a doll. He just loved to sit and rock with it. And as his disease progressed, it was something that brought like both of us a lot of comfort. And so did music. But it's another great security blanket. But other objects of comfort, pictures of home, and also like food, drink, those all can be used in terms of redirection in a way to help regulate or dysregulated seniors. Remotivation is meant to revitalize individuals who are no longer or if they've seen like a real decline in their interest or involvement. And it doesn't mean like we're forcing them to get involved in like bingo if they don't like bingo, but it's more like reorientating them by asking them like, do you like this or do you like that? And having them have a feel like of self, just reconnecting with the self and encouraging them to participate or not participate in the present based on their own preferences. So validation helps a senior feel heard and understood. It focuses on empathy and listening. And so, like outside of this demographic, we wouldn't really validate hallucinations, so to speak. But with dementia, we would acknowledge that the person, even if what they're saying isn't true or factual, or it's completely distorted. So just because someone is in distorted dimensions, right, their perception is their reality. So just feeling safe, seen, and accepted, that can reduce the agitation. So you want to listen as they're talking about maybe things that aren't there, or reliving past experiences. Ask them questions. Don't argue or press about what they are talking about isn't really happening. And you definitely don't want to argue with them. And the person with dementia is just not concerned with why they're behaving the way they do, so rather than asking them why, you want to ask them like, who are you with, or where, and why, and what, and how. And then sundowning. This is sometimes like when a person's behavior changes in the late afternoon or towards the end of the day. This is called sundowning. And during that time, a person can become intensely distressed, agitated, and have hallucinations or delusions. This can continue into the night, and it makes it hard for them to get enough sleep. Some people with dementia experience like growing sense of agitation or anxiety at this time, and it makes them feel strongly that they're like in the wrong place. And it's a really common time for violence and aggression and agitation happens. And this is especially as it pertains to the personal care and hygiene. This can be a really problematic time. So I do hope you learned something from this topic, and I apologize for going over time, but thank you so much for listening. And my final question is, what are some thoughts, questions, ideas, takeaways that you have from this seminar or this chapter on institutional violence? Thanks very much.